Hello, and welcome to the Newcastle Witches Podcast. Thank you for joining us. This is episode 15. Here endeth the lesson. This episode is dedicated to Catherine Coulter and Alice Hume. Welcome, everybody, to the final episode of the Newcastle Witches Podcast. This episode is called Here Endeth the Lesson, and so I thought I would invite Katie Ledane and David Silk back to chat with me about questions people have asked through social media, and also just to reflect on the podcast and things that have come up. So thank you both for joining me.
You're welcome. I'm a bit of a regular. I think David's been on a few as well.
Yeah, I've been on 2, I think, so far, so nice to be back.
I think when I started off this podcast, I had very much like a set idea of what I thought witches were. And I think both of you have helped me sort of debunk those those preconceptions. Namely that I thought they would all be kind of midwives, or, you know, that whole thing about the woman as the healer.
Yeah.
It's just a misunderstood person in society. And also just thinking about what doesn't get spoken about enough was the history of like pre-industrial revolution in Newcastle, and how that changed so much of society and maybe led to this witch craze that we had.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's very important to put these things in their kind of proper context, I suppose, in terms of the kind of society that produces this kind of witch craze. Not that I think, as I've said a couple of times, I think in the other episodes, I don't think we're immune to that kind of thinking anymore, but I think it manifests differently nowadays.
Yeah, it definitely makes me recognise things that are happening nowadays, and sort of I get a bit worried. Hopefully, that won't happen. But also a few people have written in with some questions, and I think the witch trials that we're talking about were a singular big event, but do we know anything, and anyone can answer, about witch trials before 1650? Anybody who was executed, anyone who was tried? Do we have any of that kind of information? Were there many, or was this really just an isolated incident? I guess in the northeast is what I'm asking.
Yeah, so the northeast kind of had much fewer witch trials than elsewhere in the UK. I just said UK, but the UK wasn't a thing then, but I'm going to breeze past it. In England and Scotland, especially in comparison to areas like East Anglia with Matthew Hopkins, and Scotland kind of had an entirely different situation happening a lot of the time. We do have records for some prior cases before 1650. In the 1560s, we see a man called William Ford, who is punished for consorting with a warlow in Newcastle. A warlow is kind of linguistically related to the word warlock, which is more often like a male practitioner of magic, even though men could be and were accused of being witches. So it's not a kind of heavily gendered binary, but warlock is more often used, especially in Scotland, for male practitioners of magic.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a kind of Scottish influence there, isn't there? It's a kind of,
Definitely, which really supports my thesis, so I was very glad to see that case. Then in the late 16th century, 1570s to 1590s, we have Alice Swan, who was accused of turning the riddle, which is a sieve balanced on a set of shears, and it was a method of divination, so either telling the future or just generally finding out unknown knowledge beyond human comprehension. And she'd use this to find lost items for her neighbours. It's quite a common crime in terms of witchcraft. Again, because this was prior to the 1603 Witchcraft Act, and it was a more minor offence, like she didn't kill anybody or anything. She just had to do public penance in St Andrew's Churchyard, essentially reading out like a pre-prepared statement saying, I have committed this crime. And she says it's for a love of filthy lucre. So she says she's doing it for money. And in her confession that she does for penance, there's a list of the fellow parishioners that she was providing this service for. So there's an element of shaming of them going on at that time as well.
So it's essentially like a pendulum, which a lot of people still use for things like dowsing or divination and things like that. And yeah, you would normally kind of, expect it to rotate one way for yes and one way for no, or something along those lines. And so they would ask, I think, oh, does such and such have your lost chicken or whatever it is? And like the sieve would rotate, and as it rotates, they would kind of take that as being signifying the answer, basically. So it's, yeah. And
sometimes you see the accused witches being accused of having stolen the item in the first place.
Okay.
Because otherwise, how would they know where it is?
Yeah.
So if you steal an item and then charge somebody to find it for them.
That's clever.
So yeah.
Solid business plan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's interesting, I think, because it's heavy. Like the shears are quite heavy, and obviously the sieve's relatively heavy. So I think it works similarly to that, where it doesn't take very much. Once you get a little bit of motion going side to side, you get what's it called? The Ouija boards work on it as well as a word for the effect that it's using. There's like a scientific phrase for.
I'm not aware of the phrase, but yeah.
But the very small movements of your hand, often like involuntary movements, essentially, of your hand, so that you don't notice that they're happening, can cause quite big movements of the object in question. So the user kind of feels like they're not controlling which direction it's turning. It kind of feels like it's turning by itself. I think dowsing works on a similar.
I was going to bring up
mechanism.
The dowsing rods, yeah.
Yeah.
And so none of these witches were actually though like tried or condemned to death or anything like that. It was.
So these two that I mentioned just there were tried and convicted, but their punishment was much lesser than it was in 1650. Closer in time period, we have Alexander Hamilton, who sometimes appears as Humbleton or Hambleton. And the sheriff of Newcastle says that he escorted Alexander Hamilton, who was known as the Devil's Chancellor, from Newcastle back up into Scotland to be burnt as a witch. And we have this in the sheriff's diary, but if you look at the actual Scottish records for the same man, there's no verdict recorded.
Okay.
So there's a kind of a bit of a miscommunication. Like Thomas Swinburne, who was the sheriff at the time, he escorted him back up into Scotland, assuming that the Scots would burn him.
But the Scots didn't burn him.
No, because Alexander Hamilton was a very good salesman in some senses. He claimed to originally be from Newcastle or Gateshead, but he kind of travelled the Anglo-Scottish border as a beggar and a vagabond. And that's what he originally appears in the Tolbooth jail for. But as soon as people found out that he was finally apprehended, a load of accusations of witchcraft come in. And they're kind of... It feels weird to say, like, standard fare of killing cattle with the devil's powers. But the accusations made against him are, like, standard fare within witchcraft studies. So sickness or death of cattle, sickness of people that he'd had disputes with. But then he starts implicating a lot of other people, saying that there's a kind of larger conspiracy of witchcraft. Mm-hmm. And one of the people that he implicates is a Lady Manderston, who is a kind of relatively wealthy woman in Scottish society on the borders. So things kind of get redirected to her, the kind of judicial energies, and he just kind of fades into the background. Quite similar to Dorothy Swinnow in the Wonderful News pamphlet. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like when I first found out about him, it was in the Thomas Swinburne diary, and that is where he mentions the Devil's Chancellor title. So I was expecting him to be like quite a wealthy and important figure, and in a lot of discussions about like male and female witchcraft practitioners, you do sometimes see that men were accused of practicing a more like learned form of magic.
Yeah.
So famous figures like John Dee, for example, It was more like written magic and scrying mirrors and things like that. So I was expecting a relative amount of like status and much more detail, but
like some nerd that's in his library that's full of books and
grimoires.
spells.
Like forbidden knowledge, but he's just a vagabond hopping between England and Scotland, arguing with people, and then they get sick. So I would love to find out a bit more about how he got that title, or whether it was just the Sheriff of Newcastle kind of embellishing his story a little bit.
Yeah, the North Berwick Witch Trials, the main witch is a schoolmaster, isn't he? The guy who they... which
I didn't know that.
I always tell school children that because I just think they kind of... It makes them look very suspiciously at their teachers.
That's fascinating. But then it seems, obviously, as we just did a whole podcast about it, how things tipped, and obviously we had the big witch trials, which we talk about. A lot of people have asked me about the witch pricker. And how do you kill so many people and have a reputation, but seemingly your name disappears?
Well, I mean, I think the real problem with that is just how few sources there are for these trials. You know, some of the stuff that Katie's been able to dig up has been great. I mean, previously the only real one that I knew of, and still I think the major source is Gardner, Ralph Gardner. And so because he doesn't record the guy's name, that's it. He vanishes. Do you know what I mean? Really, it's a case of accidental survival. If he'd thought to go, oh, by the way, this guy's name was, and write it down, then we would have his name, but we don't.
And Gardner was working 5 years later based on the accounts of 3 other people as well. So Gardner might not have known. It's less of a case of he just didn't think or didn't bother.
Yeah.
There's that extra degree of separation as well. And I think we mentioned it in the Witch Pricker episode before. I have gone in and tried to match up the story with other witch prickers that we do know were operating in Scotland at the time, especially around the borders. But we can't seem to find a man that was hanged in 1650.
Yeah, I know a number of people have tried that, because I think Jo Bath has been on the podcast as well, and I know she's attempted that at some point in the past, because I remember having a lengthy discussion with her about whether or not it could have been John Kincaid, who's usually, if you read accounts on the internet of the witch trials in Newcastle, he's the likeliest name to come up. People often will claim that it was Kincaid.
Yeah, there are a few people that just straight up say it was Kincaid, or say that Kincaid was most likely.
Yeah, But yeah, I think she kind of said, no, it really can't be, unless he's got an incredibly fast horse or something.
And his career didn't really take off until after the Newcastle Witch Trials. So I kind of used the criteria of he would have had to have been relatively close to the border and well known enough to be sent for by name. That's why George Cathy is my favourite candidate, but I can't definitively say. And George Cathy was working with an accused witch in order to identify other witches. And with Gardner being so thorough and so angry about the situation and Newcastle's councilman, I feel like he maybe would have mentioned that the Witchfinder had the audacity to be working with an accused witch in order to find more.
Although, who'd know better?
Exactly.
But still the witches were killed, and I guess this is, we found they knew he was a fraud, and still all these innocent people were killed. And I know, remember you said it was a trial and people accepted that verdict, but it still really stings me that everyone's like, no, the witch pricker is a fraud, but let's kill all these people anyway.
Yeah, I mean, Gardner's timescale's a bit confused on that as well, I think, isn't it?
Okay.
He just says that sometime between the witch trials and Gardner writing, which is about 1655, he says that the Witchfinder is caught up in Scotland and is found to be a fraud and is hanged. So it's possible that happens well after the Newcastle Witch Trials, as much as 5 years afterwards. And people might then have kind of gone, oh, well, maybe we'd best not mention that because, we've executed 15 people on the back of that, what exactly. Our guy told us. But I do think there is an element of, you know, in England particularly, more so than a lot of other European countries, that this was all done in a very kind of like legalistic way. So the witch pricker would have found the people who were then put on trial and said, yeah, these people are witches. But presumably other people that he accused, I think, did they not say that he finds 30 people and only 15 are hanged? So 15 must have got off with it, I think, like, or been acquitted in the court.
Yeah. So there is a kind of process of refining the number down, which sounds a quite like pragmatic thing to say about executing people for witchcraft. But there's originally around 30 people brought forth by or via the use of the bellman. The bellman comes out into the town and says, do you think anybody is a witch? Would you like to test them for witchcraft? And 30 people are kind of drawn out from that. And then the witchfinder, I think it's about 27, he picks by sight alone, because he boasts of himself and has a reputation that he can tell witches by sight alone.
Yeah.
Which later comes back to bite him with Paul Hobson, that we can go into in a bit more detail later. And then it's ultimately only 15 that he's able to convincingly identify as witches.
Or at least, that the court accepts the evidence against them. So I think there's an element of that where they say, well, the witchfinder himself might be a fraud, but the evidence has been put before us, and the jury have decided that these people really are witches. So
exactly.
They might have been caught by dubious means, but the evidence has come out and convicted them.
I think that's the most important part here. So you've got the idea of like the town demanding something to be done about the witches, so there's more like informal pressure, but also the pricking was used in the Newcastle cases as a more like preliminary measure. So a little bit more about identification and physical evidence, but rather than the executions happening on the basis of that physical evidence, the witches were held in jail for trial at the assizes, which was a travelling circuit of courts. So it wasn't that everything rested on the pricking.
Yeah.
There's further evidence, witness testimony and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's one of those things that, you know, even now, I think lots of people have a real dread of the idea of being accused of something and kind of hauled up in court and kind of having all this evidence put out when you know you're not guilty.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, it must have been a really horrendous experience, I think, because, as I say, you know, you're being brought up in court, and some of the evidence that was brought up is liable to have been fairly dubious, standards, I would think, you know. Things about invisibly attacking people's children or whatever, you know, and drawing on other court cases rather than knowing specifically what these people were accused of. But
exactly.
Jane Martin certainly was accused of attacking people's children sort of invisibly, and things of that sort. And I mean, yeah, it's just a horrible thing to be accused of and have people trotting this stuff out when you know that isn't true, you know.
And with John Hutton in the same same pamphlet, he died awaiting trial. Yeah. Anyway, so you've got to think about the horrible jail conditions at the time too.
Well, that's it. And I mean, we talked a little bit about that when we talked about the possibility of torture being used as well, that he, you know, we don't know whether he was kind of roughed up in prison to get names out of him or whatever. It's kind of rural northeast England, you know, it's far from impossible, I think. You know, that sort of thing happens now from time to time. So I don't think there's any reason to suppose it didn't happen in the 1600s. But
there were people that, I guess, tried to defend the witches?
Yes, so we have Eleanor Lumsdale, who actually provided one of the accounts that Gardner uses. She spent a year in jail for trying to dissuade people from giving evidence against her friend Margaret Brown. And we know that she survived the jail conditions because she gets in touch with Ralph Gardner later on. I think it's also quite telling that the executions took place next to a barracks as well, to kind of suppress any opposition or any kind of riots. So we see later examples of riots at large public hangings. So the town didn't necessarily just passively accept that quite a large proportion of a small community were being publicly executed. We have the moss troopers as well. 9 moss troopers and the 16 witches.
I mean, we spoke about that, didn't we? Of how public executions were these big fanfares and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I mean, they really were, you know, when we talk about them being public, it's not just that they were held in public; they were public events. They were kind of, you know, they were the equivalent of like county fairs and stuff like that. There was kind of and when we talked in that episode a little bit about why it ended up being banned, and it was because the authorities felt that, you know, this wasn't really a very edifying spectacle for people, you know what I mean? These kind of riotous conditions at a lot of these things. And I was reading something recently about, and it was I think it was a French account of public hangings in England, and it was saying that, you know, the English have great respect for thieves and murderers who are able to kind of be hanged, but in a kind of suitably blasé kind of fashion, and you'd have all these like crowds out to cheer these people who kind of threw their lives away very casually, sort of thing. But and yeah, they weren't always seen as being kind of great moral spectacles, like you say. There was always there were trouble at these things, you know. They weren't solemn.
I think one of the most popular questions that came through was people wanting to know if they were related to one of the witches or one of the accusers. It's really difficult for us to know that information because we have so little to go on from the actual accounts. Is there anywhere people can look or anything we can suggest to them, or is it just no? Sorry.
So in my research, kind of tracing the legacies of the witch trials, because there's so little out there, I have been able to include the vast majority of texts from 1655 to now that say Newcastle Witches. And in the early to mid 90s, there was a local genealogy ancestry journal that included the list of the accused witches and said, like, was your ancestress a witch? So it's one of these like very small anomalous blips in interest in the Newcastle Witches. And I think at that time, the response was, you're really going to struggle to find out because they're quite common names, and also for especially women at this time, we don't have a lot of information about them that you can then like map onto. There are quarter sessions records for some of the accusations that you'd be able to find at Tyne and Wear archives and museums, maybe through some of Peter Rushton's work, but I would wish you a lot of luck in tracing your family history.
Yeah, I mean, really getting back to the 1600s is difficult. I mean,
Exactly,
before
yeah.
anything pre-census becomes very hard. Like it's still a lot of work, you know, and people dedicate their whole lives to sort of family history and genealogy as a study. So it's difficult still, but you know, it's a lot easier from 1811 onwards to trace your family, because you can often find them in census records, and you can trace where people have moved to and who they're married to, and you can make reasonably sure that these are the people that you're talking about. But before that, records really aren't very complete. You might have parish records and things like that if you know exactly the parish that they live in. But even these aren't always terribly reliable or complete. I mean, that's the thing, you know, a lot of those records just aren't complete going that far back. And the further you go back, the less and less likely they are to be complete, and you'll really struggle to kind of say for sure that this Margaret Madison, for example, is that Margaret Madison in the witch trials. You know, that is not an uncommon name. If you go into the cathedral in Newcastle, there is a big memorial to the Madison family, who are an absolutely massive family of gentry in Newcastle during the Civil War. I think they were royalists and then changed sides, fairly typically, thereby surviving the whole situation relatively unscathed. But you know, they were a huge family, and they're with lots and lots of members, and they're all called things like Margaret Madison, John Madison, Henry Madison. So it can be difficult when you see these names to go like, yeah, I mean, that's definitely this guy, as opposed to any of the other, you know, Margaret Madisons or Henry Madisons who were out there at the time.
I got very excited because last year I was filming in a place called Brancepeth Castle. I don't know if you've ever been in Durham, and that it was back in the day it belonged to the Bulmer family. Yeah. And I was like, oh, maybe it's related. Yeah. And they have archives, and they're like, you're welcome to come and sift through them, but it's likely that part of the family moved out of the castle. You know, well before he was convicted. So, yeah, I thought I had unearthed something, and then I was like, no, this is
So
maybe a
it's-
dead end.
Well, a lot of
you
these
never
names
know.
as well. Yeah, I mean, you know, that's a popular thing in family history, isn't it? You get online, there'll be hundreds of websites that say like, you know, is this your family coat of arms? And there'll be ones that, you know, a member of, you know, somebody with your same surname has at some point had a coat of arms, and kind of it's often kind of touted that that means that that's therefore your coat of arms, and it's not really how these things work, in fact. But you know, and
Yeah.
you know, just because you've got the same surname as someone doesn't necessarily mean that you're closely related. Probably somewhere down the line, all these people are related. You know?
Yeah.
It's like,
It's very,
there's only-
very far back.
There's only so many people in the world.
It could be, though. You never know.
Just in reference to a period that we do have like census data for, there would be potential to talk about people that were accused of witchcraft in the 19th century. That's something that I do in the kind of middle section of my thesis. So you don't see kind of convictions for witchcraft in the 19th century, but there are traces in the newspaper archives of women accused and kind of taking their accusers to court for assault and defamation.
Be confident that, you know, that is that person. And we even managed to find years and years ago, there's a reference in the early 1800s, about 1819, to a baby being born in the castle for the first time in hundreds of years. And it's the child of a colour sergeant in the British Army. And we were able, through things like Ancestry websites and the British newspaper archives, not only to get some photographs of her dad, like this baby's dad, later in his life. He lived quite a long life. He lived into the fairly late 1800s. There was photographs of him. We also found a museum that held some of his personal belongings.
Oh, wow.
And traced some of his family to Australia, who were able to send us a photograph of his daughter when she was a very old woman that was in a family Bible. So stuff like that does kind of crop up, and you know, you can make some amazing leaps sometimes, which is great. You know, so yeah, if you can find a newspaper record of somebody being accused of witchcraft with your sort of family name on it, I think there's a good chance you could go through census records and find them if you were dedicated enough.
Yeah, so in the newspaper reports you do find a kind of a full name given, the area of the town that they're from, and often the accusations are kind of within families or within neighbourhoods at this later date. So, and especially if it's men, you'll find their career
Yeah, their occupation.
given as well. So you will need a little less luck in the 19th century than you will need in the 17th.
But talking about finding or commemorating people, the site of the actual execution, I know it's been up for some debate, but also wanted to make people aware that there are plans to commemorate the witch trials, and that's something that you and the team at Newcastle Castle, David, have been working on.
Yeah, very much egged on by Katie, in fact, when she did her placement with us. Yeah, that's something that we'd still love to see happen and is in progress. We've got permission from the City Council and they've spoken with Urban Green about the potential of having it in Lees's Park, which is part of the Old Town Moor, built on what was part of the Old Town Moor. The actual site of the gallows, I mean, is debated and may well just be under a main road somewhere, which wouldn't be a very appropriate place for a memorial. So we're looking at somewhere where people can actually see it.
Yeah.
We're hoping sort of fairly soon to start identifying some pots of funding that might be able to pay for that, and hopefully pay for an artist to design up what this memorial will look like. It's going to take some kind of physical form, but we kind of don't want to just decide what that's going to look like, basically. You know, we would quite like that to go out to some kind of consultation with local community and with artists putting in some tenders, some ideas for what this might look like, and having people choose that rather than just us say, right, we want a big plaque or whatever. I would like people's names on it somewhere, because I think it's important to remember people's names and that they are real. That to me just makes them real people.
Yeah.
But yeah, what form that will take is still to be decided. But we're hopeful that Newcastle will join Pendle and various other places in having a memorial to their
Come on, Newcastle.
Witches. Get it sorted.
Yeah, sort yourselves out. I think it's as you say, like people listen to this podcast from all over the world. It's an interesting story, but I think there is now a really strong desire to recognise sort of crimes of the past, and especially such violent crimes against women. And I really hope Newcastle does, commemorate them in a space and sort of offer people that quiet contemplation to think about, things that have happened in the city that was effectively censored.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think, I think it was an episode which was thought to be best forgotten, really, and yeah, I agree. I think, and I think, as you were saying earlier, or hinted at earlier, it brings to mind a lot of things in the modern day as well. I think it is important to recognise that the type of thinking that drives witch hunts doesn't go anywhere. It's, I think it's pretty baked into humankind on some level, and I think it's important to remember these things because, among other things, it makes you kind of second guess your own behaviour and go, okay, hang on, am I making these same mistakes? I mean,
Yeah.
Why people say it's important to learn history, really, isn't it? Avoid repeating the mistakes that people have made in the past.
This is true. I think that's my big takeaway from this podcast. And when are you publishing your book, Kate?
Oh, I've not got finished with the thesis yet. So my viva's coming up, but there is kind of scope to transform the thesis into a book eventually. It's not the first time that I've been asked, but it always gives me a little bit of a jolt of should probably do that at some point. But yeah, I'm definitely open to exploring it a bit more. The whole point of getting into the thesis was to kind of raise awareness of the Newcastle Witches, and I can't do that if I just leave my thesis on my bookshelf. So,
Indeed.
So if any publishers are listening, offer Katie money to write her book.
Yeah, we would like somebody to pay for the memorial and somebody to pay for Katie's book. That would be grand.
yes, please.
David, I also wondered, like, aside from the memorial that you guys are working on, what else have you got at the castle that people can come and see and find out and learn about this particular period of history of Newcastle?
So we've actually just been working with the university, with the students in the School of Culture and Heritage, who have been doing some work on our castle characters. So these are characters that we sort of use to interpret the history of the castle, really. So they're all real people who actually lived at the castle that we can document. And you can occasionally meet them now if you come around to the castle. We have some. We've been recruiting some volunteers as live interpreters who actually dress as some of these characters and kind of will chat to visitors and things like that. So we've got a medieval barber surgeon he can practice pulling teeth with and things like that.
Fun.
And Mary Bruce, the sister of Robert the Bruce,
Okay.
so who will gladly regale you with stuff about sort of noble life in the Middle Ages. But we've been looking to kind of do characters from different periods of history as well. The castle is originally a medieval site, but that's not the whole of its story. And so we were looking to do characters from this kind of early modern period of history, so 16th, 17th century. And the first one of those is Jane Martin, who they launched the project and have done a lot of research into Jane and have been developing things like a costume for volunteers to wear and notes and things on her life, so they can kind of help to try and bring this period to life a little bit at the castle. So we also have regular talks. So Katie comes and talks at the castle quite regularly, along with various other very erudite people on the subject of sort of witchcraft and folklore and things like that. So if you are at all interested in that side of history, in those kind of topics, then yeah, we generally have a pretty full programme of talks and things on throughout the year, which you are welcome to pop along to. They're in the Black Gate, so they are nice and comfy.
Yes, the Black
and
Gate, yeah.
Yes.
It's a great place for spooky conversations. And Katie, I know you feel very strongly about, just going back to memorials, you feel really strongly about us having one here in Newcastle. and why, and you know, like where else can people find memorials or information about witch trials across England?
So for the why, I've got about 15,000 words on this in my thesis, so I'll try to be brief. So as well as it being important to recognise victims of historical injustice in this way, so it's an important local story. The Newcastle Witch Trials and the Derwentdale accusations, slightly later in 1673, are of national significance to the history of like our understanding of witchcraft. And the Newcastle hanging in 1650 was the largest hanging for witchcraft on a single day in English history. You do have the comparison of the Chelmsford witches in the mid-1640s, but they were executed separately in batches. Again, it's a kind of bizarrely pragmatic and technical way of discussing this. But it does seem quite strange and out of place that we don't have a memorial to the largest mass hanging of witches in English history. And in kind of grounding this justification for a memorial in the proposal that I've been working on with the castle and within my own thesis, I've been comparing with other pre-existing memorials to kind of guide what Newcastle can and should be doing for its victims of witch hunts. So bizarrely, there was no kind of plaque or permanent memorial to the Pendle witches until 2001.
That is strange because it is so famous.
Exactly, it's so well known
Yeah.
with the plays and kind of Potts discussion of it being like widely published. Like it, the legacy kind of started immediately after the trials concluded. So you had hundreds of years of cultural awareness of the Pendle witches, but no kind of physical memorial until 2001. And that was in a pub called the Golden Lion. It kind of gained a reputation as the site that those condemned to death by hanging at Lancaster Castle, it was the site of their last drink as they were making a procession up to where the gallows were. It's kind of quite a dubious claim.
I mean, that sounds pretty nice. You know, I suppose I'd probably like a pint before, you know. But...
Yeah, I do. I think they have some kind of more solid material to suggest that was happening maybe a bit later on in history, but it's very dubious to suggest that the witches kind of stopped off for a pint on the way to their execution site. But the plaque was put there by the Northwest branch of the Pagan Federation.
Okay.
So there is a kind of really interesting intersection between historical witchcraft and things that people are more familiar with in terms of witchcraft today, and Wicca and New Age religion and things like that. And they did have quite a nuanced approach. It wasn't the idea that those executed in the 17th century are also Wiccans. There was a kind of more fluid sense of kind of kinship and empathy. And it was done in 2001 to mark the 50th anniversary of the Fraudulent Mediums Act.
Okay.
So
that's season 3 of the podcast.
So I'll not get into that because it's an entire thing. But you definitely can like map a cultural relationship and legacy with 17th century witch trials that extends throughout history and lore and pop culture, things like that.
It's definitely, it's sort of in the zeitgeist again, I think. I actually just got interviewed for somebody, I think it was Newcastle College, a young lady, also called Katie actually, but she was doing a documentary about witchcraft on Instagram and social media, but wanting to talk a bit about historical witchcraft and the Newcastle Witch Trials. So I think, there's definitely an awareness around that again. I think you're right to say, like in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, that was very...
Yeah. So in terms of where people can look more for, discussions of other memorials. You've got the campaigns for a national memorial in Scotland. There are already several associated with localised witch hunts. I think there's one in Preston Pans in Forfar. There was some really interesting stuff that came out in the 4th centenary of the Pendle Witch Trials in 2012. There was a set of 10 tercets, the kind of way markers, and each contained a line of a poem written by Carol Ann Duffy about our cultural relationship with the Pendle Witches today. I actually went to Lancaster on a research trip a couple of years ago, and it was kind of weird to find that there are also buses emblazoned with figures in pointed hats and riding broomsticks. So it's very much part of that town's identity in a way. So it's nice to see that is then being backed up with an actual memorial, as opposed to the more witch kitsch side of things.
Okay. I don't have any other questions. I guess it's quite sad, really. This is the end. It's been such a journey.
It's been fantastic. It's been really nice to be involved, to be honest. It's been great listening to it. And
I've learned so much and discovered so much about just the history of Newcastle doing this. And so thank you to everyone for listening, but also thank you to all our guests. I know, Katie, you've been on the podcast quite a few times and you shared a lot of your research, so thank you so much. And also thank you, David, and the team at Newcastle Castle, because you first sort of inspired me to start digging further into this and thinking about the history of a site and a place and how that extended. So thank you so much for being part of the Newcastle Witches Podcast, and thank you to everyone for listening.